This incident happened to me last year, right on Halloween. My younger sister and I were home alone, since our parents had gone to a Halloween party in town. They had left us with the job of handing out candy to all the trick-or-treaters, which was a huge disappointment for both of us. We had originally planned to go out trick-or-treating with some friends, but that got canceled. Our parents told us we were too old to be going out for candy, and instead suggested that we invite our friends over to hang out. Unfortunately, my friends weren't interested in coming over since they still planned on going trick-or-treating. That left me at home with my sister, tasked with giving out candy to all the kids in the neighborhood. It was a busy night with loads of people stopping by for treats. By around 10 o'clock, nearly all the candy was gone. With so few trick-or-treaters left, my sister and I decided to indulge ourselves in what was left. We settled on the couch, put on a scary movie, and started devouring the remaining candy, when a knock suddenly came from the front door. Annoyed, I got up from the couch, wondering who would be knocking at this late hour. I assumed it was just a few stragglers still trying to score candy. However, I had turned off the porch light and all our Halloween decorations, which should have signaled that we were out of candy or weren't answering the door. The only other explanation was that our parents had returned early from their party. Feeling cautious, I checked through the peephole, and what I saw sent a wave of unease through me. A strange man was standing on our front porch. He was dressed in a black hoodie, the hood pulled over his head, making it hard to see his face. From what I could make out, he had a beard and dry, cracked lips. It was clear that this man wasn't a trick-or-treater. He wasn't wearing a costume, and he looked far too old to be out on his own asking for candy. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of his hoodie, and he appeared thin and nervous. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, and I knew immediately I wasn't going to open the door. Watching him through the peephole, I saw him knock again, a little more insistently this time. There was something off about the way he moved, almost desperate. He was trembling, but the night wasn't cold enough for someone to be shaking like that. The situation was making me uneasy, and I just wanted him to leave. I raised my voice, telling him that we were out of candy and couldn't help him. Through the peephole, I watched as a smile slowly crept onto his face, but it wasn't a friendly one. The expression sent a chill down my spine. His voice, when he finally spoke, was raspy and unsettling, asking in a mocking tone if we were alone inside the house. My sister, who had been watching from behind, whispered if we should call the police. I wasn't sure what to do. The man seemed to overhear her, and with a low, almost amused growl, he commented that it didn't seem like we were alone after all. I kept my eyes locked on him through the peephole, trying to assess whether he might be armed. His hands were still buried in his hoodie pockets, and the trembling had not stopped. My mind raced with possibilities, and I realized I couldn't take any chances. In the sternest voice I could muster, I threatened him, telling him to leave immediately or I'd call the police. His reaction was instant. His smile disappeared, replaced with a grimace that revealed yellowed, rotting teeth. The fury in his eyes was unmistakable. He glared at the door for a long moment before turning to leave, clearly deciding not to push his luck. I kept watching him through the peephole until I saw him disappear completely from our yard, the tension slowly ebbing away. My sister and I let out a collective sigh of relief, but we stayed on edge for the rest of the night. We didn't end up calling the police, figuring that since the man hadn't tried to force his way in, there wasn't much they could do. When our parents came home later, we didn't mention the incident. At the time, it felt like no real harm had been done. But the next day, everything changed. We learned that the elderly woman who lived just a few houses down had been found dead on her porch. Her body had been discovered by her neighbor, covered in blood, with multiple stab wounds to her chest and neck. As soon as we heard the news, my sister and I knew exactly who was responsible. We told the police everything we could remember about the man who had been at our door, but there wasn't much we could offer in terms of identification. His face had been obscured, and we hadn't noticed many distinct features. Despite their efforts to search for him, the authorities were never able to catch him. To this day, I can't shake the guilt that weighs on me. If we had called the police when the man first came to our door, maybe they could have caught him before he reached that poor woman's house. The most disturbing part of it all was that nothing in her home had been stolen. It was clear that he hadn't been there to rob her. His only intent had been to kill. Thinking back, I realized how close we came to being his victims. That night changed the way I look at people and situations, and the regret of not acting sooner is something I'll always carry. This happened when I was around 12 years old, and my brother was 17. It's an experience that reminds me every Halloween that sometimes the living can be far scarier than the dead. Though this isn't a paranormal tale, it still lingers in my mind. The community we grew up in was largely influenced by the local folklore, particularly the legend of the Weeping Woman. This story was especially popular during the Halloween season. For those who aren't familiar, the story of the Weeping Woman revolves around a woman who, after discovering her husband's infidelity, was driven into a state of despair. In her grief, she drowned her children in the river. Realizing what she had done, she took her own life by throwing herself into the same waters. However, she couldn't move on to the afterlife without her children, so she roams the riverside, searching for them. The story is often told to frighten children and keep them from playing near rivers, warning them that she might mistake them for her lost children and drag them to the afterlife. That particular Halloween, most of my friends had decided they were too old to go trick-or-treating, opting instead for a Halloween party. I was a bit disappointed, feeling like I was still young enough to enjoy the thrill of collecting candy. My brother, seeing my disappointment, offered to take me out trick-or-treating himself. I jumped at the chance. We headed out while it was still daylight so I could join my friend's party later in the evening. Because we started so early, many houses hadn't started handing out candy yet. After wandering through nearly empty streets, with only a few pieces of candy to show for it, we decided to call it a night and head back home. As we walked, we passed by a park that was known for its tradition of older kids gathering on Halloween in hopes of catching a glimpse of the Weeping Woman near the river that bordered the park. It had been a local tradition for as long as anyone could remember, and though we didn't plan to join them, the park caught our attention. That evening, however, the park was unusually quiet. The teens hadn't arrived yet, as it was still too early. What we did notice was a small group setting up for a performance. Curious, we decided to watch. There were only a few other people there, a couple of kids who seemed to be part of the group performing. They weren't in costumes, and it didn't seem like they were trick-or-treating either. As we took our seats on the grass, a woman from the group approached us and asked if we had been out gathering candy. I told her we had, and she smiled warmly as she dropped a small comic book into my trick-or-treat bag. She seemed friendly enough, but something about her energy felt slightly off. The play began, and right away, I got the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. The woman playing the role of the Weeping Woman started addressing my brother and me directly, asking us about our faith. My brother, without hesitation, mentioned that we were Catholic. The actress then went on a strange tangent about how the Weeping Woman, too, had been Catholic and was now suffering in hell for her sins. She claimed that Halloween was a celebration of evil, and that those who participated would face the same fate. As the performance continued, the content became more bizarre and disturbing. At one point, the Weeping Woman character started discussing sensitive topics like abortion, holding up a fake fetus and mimicking grotesque actions that left us both feeling deeply uncomfortable. That was when my brother decided we needed to leave. As we stood up, the group members noticed and tried to stop us, shouting for us to stay seated. Sensing that things were escalating, my brother grabbed my hand and we began walking briskly away. To our shock, they started following us. At first, it was a few people yelling at us to accept their beliefs, but their shouting soon turned to chanting. My brother, clearly concerned for our safety, picked up the pace, and we ended up running down the street as the group continued to pursue us. I could feel my heart pounding as we finally reached our street. By then, only a few of them were still trailing behind, but they were relentless, shouting about salvation and condemning us for trick-or-treating. When we made it home, my brother locked the front door and hurriedly checked all the windows to make sure everything was secure. He called our dad at work explaining the situation. My father, alarmed, told us to contact the police and assured us he would be home soon. By the time our dad arrived, the group was still outside, gathered at the edge of our property, chanting prayers and singing hymns, asking for God to save our souls. My father, furious, confronted them, telling them to leave immediately, warning that the police were on their way. They didn't seem fazed and continued their chants until the police arrived. It wasn't until the officers threatened to arrest them that they finally dispersed. That night, I didn't feel like going to the party anymore. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, sorting through my Halloween candy and setting aside my brother's favorite candy bars, Snickers, as a small thank you for looking out for me. My mom ordered pizza, and we settled in to watch a Halloween movie. Halfway through organizing my candy, I pulled out the comic book the woman had given me earlier. Flipping through it, I was horrified. It was a bizarre, religious comic about a boy who, after visiting a haunted house, died in an accident and went to hell because he hadn't accepted the right faith. For weeks, I was haunted by nightmares, the comic book and the events of that night replaying in my mind. Even years later, when I was much older, I asked my mom if she remembered the incident. She did. Apparently, it hadn't ended there. For years afterward, the group continued leaving strange letters at our house, addressed to my brother and me. Inside were more unsettling comics and handwritten notes, filled with eerie messages about how they were praying for us. They even included odd promises like baking cakes for us in an attempt to lure us to their church. To this day, we never figured out how they learned our names or why they targeted us so persistently. It still creeps me out when I think about it. I was lured into a sinister Halloween trap. Here's my story. I finished work earlier than expected today, so I decided to go for a run. I started at around 4:30 in the afternoon and, instead of taking my usual route, which crosses several busy streets, I opted for a quieter path along a canal and through some woods. I figured it would be less crowded and more peaceful. Everything was going smoothly, and I kept a steady pace, covering about 6 kilometers before I reached a stretch of path that was straight and relatively deserted. On one side of the path was a canal, calm and still, while on the other side was a large area of wasteland. It used to be home to several factories, but they had mostly been demolished years ago. The area had since become overgrown with trees and weeds, though there were remnants of the old buildings scattered about, including bits of rusty metal and crumbling walls that hadn't been fully torn down. As I reached a particular section of the wasteland where a part of the factory still stood, complete with some old metal steps, I noticed a man sitting on a nearby wall. He looked disheveled, and when he saw me, he jumped to his feet and called out, though I couldn't make out what he said. As I got closer, I heard him asking for help, saying that he had lost his phone. He said this while making his way down the stairs, so I stopped when I reached the spot where the bottom of the steps was, leaving a fence between us. The fence was old and made of iron, with vertical bars that had spikes at the top, the kind you sometimes see around historical buildings. He asked again if I could help him find his phone, explaining that he had dropped it nearby. He then requested that I call his number, hoping to hear it ring so he could locate it. I felt it would be awkward to refuse, especially since my phone was strapped to my arm. So, I agreed and told him to give me the number. As I unstrapped my phone and unlocked it, he quickly rattled off a series of numbers, but something seemed off. He spoke too fast, and the number didn't even start with the usual digits I expected, which gave me pause. Despite feeling uneasy, I wasn't overly concerned at that point. I was in good shape with a size and weight advantage over him, and we were separated by the fence. He didn't seem particularly strong, and I suspected he might be homeless, given his appearance. Still, I kept my distance, staying alert to his movements, especially his hands, in case he tried anything. I told him I hadn't caught the number and asked him to repeat it, which he did, this time starting with the correct digits. I began entering the numbers into my phone, but before I could finish, he started looking around the ground, saying he could hear it ringing. At that moment, another man appeared from behind a section of the crumbling wall to my right. He was much larger and looked just as scruffy as the first man. His eyes were glazed, and it seemed like he might be under the influence of something. He said that he, too, could hear the phone ringing and gestured for me to come through a gap in the fence to help them search. The first man chimed in, insisting again that it was ringing, even though I hadn't finished dialing the number yet. This confirmed my suspicions that they were trying to lure me over to their side of the fence. They continued urging me to come closer, saying they could hear the phone nearby. At one point, I overheard the second man mutter to the first, "He's not going to fall for it." He spoke quietly, as if he thought I wouldn't hear, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and his voice carried clearly. That's when I knew for certain that something was wrong. The first man, growing frustrated, began acting more aggressive. He started punching a nearby tree, telling me that he desperately needed his phone and that his whole life was on it. While he was ranting, I noticed that the second man had taken a few steps to the right, moving toward a gap in the fence where some of the bars had been removed. I realized that they might be trying to corner me, and by now it was after 5 p.m., and the light had faded, casting everything in an eerie twilight. I made up my mind quickly. There was no way I was going to stick around to see what would happen next. I turned and sprinted away as fast as I could. Neither of them shouted after me or gave chase, which only made me more certain that their intentions had been malicious. If they had genuinely needed help, they would have called out, asking where I was going or trying to explain further. Instead, when I glanced back after running for a solid 20 to 30 seconds, I saw them standing by the gap in the fence, just watching me as I ran. They didn't move or try to follow. I kept running until I was far enough away to feel safe, eventually getting off the canal path and onto the main roads. Later, I called to report the incident, giving the details and descriptions of the two men. The person on the other end of the line took my information but didn't seem too concerned, saying it would be looked into. The whole experience left me feeling unsettled, and I'm pretty sure I won't be taking that route alone anytime soon. I live in Connecticut, in a busy city where public transportation is the main way to get around. This includes the subway, and having lived here nearly all my life, I've seen it all, some bizarre, some scary. Over the years, I've encountered a number of strange situations. Once, a man sat next to me and behaved inappropriately, and another time I was randomly punched by a woman. But today, I want to tell you about something far more unsettling that still gives me chills when I think back on it. Back when I was in high school, my friends and I often used the subway to commute. Our school was located in the heart of the city, near several major universities, so the area was always bustling with students and tourists. I had a close friend who would accompany me on the subway ride home almost every day. We were both 14 sophomores, and like most teenagers, we felt invincible, or at least we thought we were. This incident took place one winter evening, right after our after-school club activities. It was around 5 p.m., and since it was winter, the sun had already set. The cold had settled in, and darkness came quickly. The walk to the subway station from our school usually took about 15 minutes. The route led us through a college campus with wide pathways lined by trees that had lost all their leaves. The light poles created long shadows, and our breath hung in the cold air as we talked about our day. The streets were busy with students heading home, tourists in groups, and the occasional car rushing by. As we made our way through the campus, I began to feel an odd sense that someone was behind us. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, this was a busy area, and it wasn't unusual for people to be walking in the same direction. But as we continued, the uneasy feeling grew. It wasn't just that someone was behind us. It was that they had been there for too long. Normally, people would pass us by, hurrying to their destination, but whoever was behind us wasn't doing that. I tried to ignore it, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. When we reached a crosswalk, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned my head slightly, just enough to get a glimpse of who was following us. My stomach flipped when I saw him. He wasn't just another student or passerby. He was a middle-aged man, likely in his 50s or even older. He wore a dark green windbreaker, a black beanie, and a scarf that was wrapped tightly around his nose and mouth, covering most of his face. His baggy black pants rustled with every step, and the heavy boots he wore made an unsettling crunch on the snow-covered sidewalk. What struck me the most was how close he was, barely 5 feet behind us. Close enough that I felt like my backpack, which was stuffed with textbooks, might accidentally swing back and hit him if I wasn't careful. His presence was invasive, like he had deliberately positioned himself too near. My heart started racing. Something about him just felt off. I tried to stay calm and kept walking, hoping he would pass us, but he didn't. If anything, he seemed to be getting closer. Every step he took made my anxiety spike higher. I glanced at my friend, who was still preoccupied with her phone, occasionally checking and replying to messages. I felt a knot of dread forming in my stomach. I wasn't the type to panic easily, but the way this man was acting, the way he was following us, sent every internal alarm blaring. I decided to text my friend instead of speaking out loud, afraid that he might overhear us if I said anything. Quickly typed, "Man behind us. Creepy. It's been 10 minutes. She replied almost immediately. I noticed. I don't know what to do. I could tell from her response that she was starting to feel as uncomfortable as I was. As we continued walking, the streets became a little less busy. The groups of students and tourists had dispersed, leaving us more isolated than I liked. I could hear his boots pounding against the salted snow, and I could almost feel his eyes on us, watching our every move. My skin crawled with the sensation of being hunted. By now, the fear was almost palpable between my friend and me, though neither of us said anything. Instead, I leaned in and whispered a plan to her. Since we were still on the college campus, there were bound to be some large tour groups ahead. I suggested that we weave our way through one of those crowds and then take an immediate right down a different path that led to another gate out of the college. This wasn't our usual route, but it would bring us closer to the subway station. Maybe, just maybe, we could lose him in the crowd. We sped up and soon spotted a group of around 40 or 50 tourists gathered around a popular statue. It was the perfect opportunity. Without a word, we maneuvered through the crowd, staying close to each other. I didn't dare look back to see if he was still following us, but the tightness in my chest told me he probably was. Once we were through the crowd, we took the sharp right and sped toward the alternate gate, our footsteps crunching on the snow-covered path. When we finally reached the gate, I dared to glance behind us. Relief flooded over me. He was gone. For a moment, I thought we had shaken him off, but I didn't let myself relax completely. We quickly made our way down to the subway station, our pace still hurried. The subway was always busy at this time of day, especially on a Friday evening when people were heading home from work. We paid for our tickets and headed to the platform, looking for a place to sit while we waited for the train. Amid the crowd, we managed to find a bench near the far end of the platform. I sat on the right and my friend sat on the left. I finally felt like I could breathe again. The station was noisy, filled with the chatter of commuters and the distant rumble of approaching trains. I thought we were safe, but that feeling didn't last long. Not even 30 seconds after we sat down, I felt the same presence from earlier. My body went rigid. Slowly, I looked to my side. It was him, the same man who had followed us from the campus. I recognized his boots, the same heavy Timberland boots, the same baggy black pants tucked into them. He stood right next to me, close enough that I could hear his heavy breathing. I didn't need to look up to know he was staring at me. The menace in his presence was overwhelming, like a dark cloud hovering over me. I nudged my friend, who had been looking at her phone. She froze when she realized what was happening. We were both paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The station was crowded, but no one else seemed to notice what was happening. It was as if we were trapped in a bubble of fear, invisible to everyone around us. Then, the familiar chime of the train's arrival announcement echoed through the station. The train was coming. I shot up from the bench, grabbing my friend's arm. We pushed through the crowd, making our way to the train doors. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with panic. I noticed the man had moved too, standing near a different set of train doors further down the platform. It struck me as odd that he hadn't followed us to the same door. Maybe he was planning something else, something even more sinister. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for the right moment to act. As the train pulled in and the doors opened, people flooded out, and we waited for everyone to clear. The man had already gotten on the train by the time we moved to step in. I glanced up at the train schedule and saw that another train would arrive in just 2 minutes. That's when a plan formed in my mind. I pulled my friend to the side, hesitating for just a second as the warning beeps began signaling that the doors were about to close. At the last possible moment, I yanked my friend back onto the platform, and the train doors shut in front of us. The train began to move, but just before it disappeared into the tunnel, I saw him again. He sprinted toward the doors, his hands slamming against the glass. His eyes locked on us with a terrifying intensity. My heart stopped for a second. He banged on the window as the train carried him away, and we stood there, frozen, watching him disappear into the darkness of the tunnel. Once the train was gone, my friend collapsed onto the platform in tears, and I wasn't far from breaking down myself. We were just kids, and this was a nightmare we hadn't been prepared for. I helped her to her feet, and we both boarded the next train in silence, too shaken to speak. When we finally arrived at our stop, we parted ways without saying much. We never told anyone about what had happened, though in hindsight, we probably should have reported it. I met up with my friend a few days ago, and we were reminded of that night. I still shudder when I think about it, but I'm just glad we were safe in the end. I'm a tall guy, and I always thought of myself as pretty tough. Not much can shake me, but even now, years later, there are still moments from my old job that send shivers down my spine. Back then, I worked the night shift at a massive shopping complex. It stayed busy until around 8:30 in the evening, and by 9:30 we'd finally get the last stragglers out of there. By about 11 o'clock, all the shop owners and employees would have left, and that's when my real job began, making sure no one stayed behind after the mall closed its doors. Our gear wasn't anything special, just a can of mace which was almost never used. Occasionally, we'd catch some would-be thieves trying to hide and break into shops overnight, but with 4 or 5 security personnel on duty, most of them didn't dare put up a fight. We usually outnumbered them, and a few of the other guards looked pretty intimidating, myself included. But one night was different. That's when things started to get really strange. It was around 2 a.m., and I was sitting in the food court eating a sandwich. The food court was one of the only areas that had some natural light at night, thanks to a large skylight, so it was a comfortable spot for a break. As I was sitting there, I heard this strange sound, something metallic scraping across the floor from the direction of the hallway leading to the restrooms. The noise immediately put me on alert. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way toward the hall. The closer I got, the louder the sound became, and by the time I reached the restroom doors, it was echoing in the hallway. The noise seemed to be coming from the women's restroom. With my heart racing, I cautiously pushed the door open just a little. The scraping was louder now, but it wasn't fear I felt. It was confusion. There shouldn't have been anyone in there. I called out, letting whoever was inside know that I was there, but the noise stopped abruptly. That's when I noticed it, quiet breathing, slow and deliberate. My nerves spiked. I held the door, took a deep breath, and tried my radio to call for backup. Strangely, no one responded. This wasn't normal. Our policy required constant communication, and not hearing anything back made me feel uneasy. I tried again, but still silence. Something was definitely wrong. I pushed the door open just a bit more, trying to sound intimidating, but inside I was already on edge. No response came from the room. I stood there, waiting, my nerves frayed. The silence became unnerving, but I couldn't hear anything else now. I yelled again, warning that I was coming in, though my voice betrayed how shaken I was. I slowly swung the door open, scanning the room with my flashlight. Every stall was open, and yet no one was in sight. The room was empty. My gut told me something was off, though. It felt like a scene straight out of a horror film. I stepped further inside, and that's when I heard it, the creak of the door behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, and there he was, a massive man, at least a head taller than me, with graying hair and a sickening grin on his face. He stood there, frozen mid-step, staring right at me. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. I was frozen in place. He lifted a finger to his lips as if to silence me. Then, in an instant, he swung the door open and ran out, clutching a small metal box. My mind raced. He must have been hiding right behind the door when I first opened it, and I hadn't even noticed. The thought hit me like a punch. If he'd been armed, he could have killed me right then and there. The fear that gripped me at that moment is something I'll never forget. It was only later, when my radio finally started working again, that I told my coworkers what had happened. Their faces paled as I spoke. They had heard stories before, similar ones in fact, but none of them had come as close to danger as I had that night. I stuck around for another week before I quit. There was no way I was staying in that job. I couldn't trust the radio anymore, and knowing that it failed me when I needed help still doesn't sit right with me. That night was the last time I ever saw the man. I never found out what happened to him or what he was doing with that metal box. The other guards did a full sweep of the mall after I met up with them, but they didn't find anyone. I didn't join the sweep. I was too rattled by everything that had just happened. A few years ago, I was renting a small home just outside the outskirts of Bend, Oregon. The area was close to the suburbs, but still far enough out to feel like you were in the wilderness. It seemed like an ideal spot, a balance between having neighbors close enough for comfort and still maintaining a sense of privacy. The roads were narrow and winding, with no streetlights to guide the way at night. When the sky was clear, the moonlight gave the area a faint glow, but on overcast nights, the darkness was almost oppressive. I found this eerie stillness to be part of the house's charm, giving it a cozy, almost secluded feel. One evening in the dead of winter, I came home from a long shift at work. It had been an exhausting day, made worse by some extra overtime hours that left me drained. The sky was thick with clouds, and the darkness was especially heavy as I pulled into the driveway. The only light came from my headlights and the small porch light I had left on earlier. As I got out of the car, I caught the scent of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. That struck me as strange because I had never noticed it around my house before. I couldn't see anyone around, though, and chalked it up to the cold air playing tricks on my tired mind. I went inside, eager to wind down for the night. After a quick shower, I decided to head straight to bed, even though it wasn't yet 7 p.m. The thought of a warm blanket and a few hours of uninterrupted sleep was too tempting to pass up. I quickly drifted off, only to wake up some time later. My senses were instantly alert, and I was certain I had heard something. A faint noise, like movement, coming from inside the house. Initially, I wasn't too concerned. I had given a close friend of mine a spare key for emergencies, and occasionally, he'd drop by unannounced after work to use my shower. Still, he would usually send me a message ahead of time, and my phone had been silent. Curious, I reached over to check my phone, which was lying on the bedside table. The screen's bright light immediately blinded me, its harsh glow cutting through the darkness. This was before phones had automatic dimmers, so the display was jarringly bright in a dark room. My eyes squinted as I tried to read the time. It was around 9 p.m., but I couldn't tell if I had missed any notifications. I didn't hear anything else, but a sense of unease began to settle over me. I set my phone down and called out my friend's name, half expecting to hear him answer from downstairs. Instead, there was only silence for a moment, followed by a sudden, loud thud. Someone or something was running through the house. My heart pounded as I jumped out of bed, adrenaline instantly kicking in. Without thinking, I rushed to my closet, hoping to hide. By the time I opened the door and stepped inside, I could hear the heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, fast and purposeful. The upstairs portion of the house had 3 rooms, a master bedroom, which I was in, a smaller guest room on the opposite side of the hallway, and a bathroom at the end. I listened, barely breathing, as the intruder thundered down the hall. To my relief, they went straight past my room and into the bathroom. I realized this was my only chance. I pulled on the attic access in the closet ceiling and started to hoist myself up. My movements felt painfully slow, my body heavy with panic. Just as I was lifting my feet into the attic, the person came charging back out of the bathroom. My bedroom door burst open with a loud crash. From my position, crouched just above the closet's opening, I could only see their legs, a pair of dirty, worn-out jeans and scuffed work boots. They stood in the room for what felt like an eternity, scanning it, trying to figure out where I had gone. Then, without warning, they sprinted across the hall to the guest room, which was mostly empty except for a few boxes and a desk where I occasionally worked on my hobbies. When they didn't find anyone there, they rushed back into my bedroom, this time flicking on the lights. The sudden brightness flooded the space below me, and I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't notice the open attic hatch. Moments later, the closet door was yanked open, and I braced myself for the worst. From my hiding spot, I could see the tops of their boots as they stood at the entrance, scanning the closet. They stayed there for several agonizing seconds, seemingly deciding whether to search further. My heart was pounding so loudly that I feared they might hear it. Finally, they stepped back. That's when I heard the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor, followed by a frustrated scream that chilled me to my core. It was filled with rage, and it reminded me too much of my stepfather, who had a similar explosive temper. The memory sent a shiver down my spine. My stepfather had struggled with mental health issues, and his fits of anger had been unpredictable and terrifying. The intruder stormed downstairs, and I heard more crashes as they threw things around in a fit of frustration. I stayed frozen in place, afraid to move. My phone was still on the bedside table, far out of reach. I knew I couldn't climb down without risking being heard. So I waited, listening as the chaos continued. After a while, the noises stopped. I started counting in my head to calm myself down, reaching 1,000 before I finally dared to move. When I climbed down, the first thing I noticed was that my bed had been overturned, likely in a desperate attempt to find me. The entire room was a mess, but my phone was nowhere to be seen. I quickly ran to the landline near my bed and called the police. The officers arrived soon after, and I stayed in my room until I heard them calling up from the front door. Downstairs, the destruction was worse than I had imagined. Furniture had been upended, shelves cleared of their contents, and the kitchen cabinets had been emptied onto the floor. Oddly enough, the only thing that appeared to be missing was a kitchen knife from the block on the counter. The police found evidence that the side door had been forced open, likely with a crowbar. They also found cigarette butts near the fence line along with some paraphernalia indicating drug use. It seemed the intruder had been watching my house for some time before deciding to break in. The officers suggested that I stay somewhere else for the night and recommended fixing the door as soon as possible. Instead of leaving, I chose to stay, moving a heavy shelf in front of the damaged door. I spent the rest of the night cleaning up the mess, but every so often, I found myself peeking out the window, shining a flashlight along the fence line where the cigarette butts had been found. I didn't see anything, but the fear lingered. The next day, I had the door repaired and installed motion-activated lights around the house. I even ran a phone line into the attic, just in case I ever found myself hiding up there again. In the years that followed, nothing else happened in that house. I stayed there for another 3 years without any further incidents, but the memory of that night never fully left me. As a final precaution, I began practicing how to quickly and quietly get into the attic in case I ever needed to hide again. Even after I moved to a new house, I kept up the routine, though now, I practiced crawling into a hidden space at the back of my closet instead. I still think about what might have happened if I had been just a little slower or if the intruder hadn't gone into the bathroom first. When I was 18, I had a job working at the front desk of my college's residence building. It was a relatively quiet position most of the time, but one night I found myself in a situation that still makes me wonder what could have happened. Looking back, I believe I narrowly avoided either an assault or something even worse, but I'll let you be the judge. During the summer months, the building functioned partially as a hotel. 2.5 floors were set aside for hotel guests, while the other half of the third floor was for students who lived there year-round. The whole place operated with a keycard system that was, to put it mildly, outdated. The locks on all the doors were powered by 4 AA batteries, and if the batteries died, it took a fairly tedious process to replace and reprogram the door. One night, around 1 or 2 a.m., I was working an overnight shift when a dark-haired man approached the desk from inside the building. He told me he'd left his keycard in his room and asked for a new one. Without thinking too much of it, I printed him a replacement key. That was my first mistake. Technically, hotel guests could get as many room keys as they needed, but students were supposed to be given a temporary key, with a small $2 charge applied to their account until they returned it. He claimed he was a student, and although I should have checked the system to charge his account, I was distracted with other tasks and didn't bother. At the time, I was far too trusting, a lesson I would soon learn the hard way. Later that night, closer to 3 or 4 a.m., he returned to the desk. This time, he said he couldn't get into his room. I asked if he had forgotten his key again, but he explained that the door wasn't responding at all. I inquired if the light on the door lock came on when he swiped his card, and he said it didn't. This likely meant the batteries in the door had died. I told him I would have to change the batteries, so I grabbed the repair kit and went upstairs with him. He asked for my name, which I gave, though he didn't offer his. When we arrived at the room, I manually unlocked the door with the master key, explaining that I'd need to prop the door open while I worked on the back panel. Instead, he insisted on closing and deadbolting the door behind us. It felt strange, but I convinced myself it wasn't too out of the ordinary. Perhaps he didn't want anyone seeing into his room while I worked. He had a thick accent, and I assumed he might be an international student, so I chalked the odd behavior up to a cultural or language barrier. Still, the situation was making me uneasy. As I focused on replacing the batteries, he started mentioning problems with the room. He claimed the bed was broken and needed fixing, and he threw a small key under the bed, telling me to retrieve it. Then he mentioned a leak under the fridge, insisting I take a look. His tone wasn't overtly threatening, but his repeated attempts to get me to kneel or lie down set off alarm bells. I declined each time, saying that maintenance would look into it in the morning if there were any real issues. What really unnerved me was when he asked if I would take off my glasses. I said no, explaining that I needed them to see, but he persisted. He calmly told me it was fine to take them off and, without warning, reached around from behind me to try to remove them himself. I swatted his hand away, forcing a polite refusal, but my heart was racing. I didn't want to make him angry or cause a scene, but every fiber of my being told me I was in danger. At that point, I quickly undid the door's deadbolt, opened it, and pretended to need something from the repair kit. He moved toward the door, attempting to close it again, but I insisted it had to stay open for me to finish fixing the lock. As I kept one foot on the door to prevent him from shutting it, he started fiddling with my hair and touched my shoulder, which I also pushed away. The tension in the room was becoming unbearable, and I was desperate to leave. Before I left, I glanced around the room again. That's when I realized something was off. There were no personal items anywhere. No dishes, no shower curtain, no sheets on the bed. It was completely empty. This wasn't his room. He had been lying the entire time. I tried to act as if everything was fine and told him the door was fixed. I quickly gathered the repair kit and headed for the elevator. Just as I expected, he followed me out into the hallway. He tried to call me back, saying the door still wasn't working and that I needed to return. I unlocked the door manually for him one last time, making it clear that maintenance would handle any remaining issues in the morning. Once he was inside, I bolted for the stairwell and ran all the way back to the front desk. When I got there, I checked the computer system and saw that the room he had been in was supposed to be vacant. It wasn't assigned to a student or a hotel guest. I quickly locked myself in the back office and called campus security. Not long after, he came down to the desk again, but this time I knew better. He tried to come behind the desk, and I ordered him to stay on the other side. He grabbed a scrap of paper, doodled a flower on it, and left it on top of my paperwork, as if that was normal. When security arrived, they escorted him back upstairs to the room, where he kept insisting he lived. They asked him to show his student ID, but he couldn't. He couldn't even remember his supposed room number. When security pressed him for his details, it became clear he was making everything up. The phone number he provided was just random digits. His name came with a hesitant M, as though he were trying to invent it on the spot. When they asked where he lived, He simply said, "Across the street." When they asked if he lived in one of the nearby apartment buildings, he said yes, but couldn't provide an address. He even claimed his apartment number was 1200, but I knew later that no such apartment existed. Security asked him why he had been sneaking around, but all he could say was that he didn't know. He couldn't offer any explanation. He tried to claim he was a friend of mine, but I made it clear that I had never seen him before that night. Ultimately, they escorted him off the property, and since he hadn't technically done anything criminal, no police were involved. Even so, the whole experience left me deeply unsettled. I later realized how he might have found that vacant room. A housekeeper had been using it as her unofficial break room, and she must have left it unlocked when she left for the night. He'd likely wandered in, realizing it was empty. I never saw him again after that night, and though I eventually left that job, I still get chills thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. Working overnight shifts never quite felt the same again. I currently work at a restaurant in a small town located in the heart of the Midwest. It's a modest place, nestled on a bustling main road where cars zoom by constantly, and people are always walking to nearby shops or waiting at the bus stop. We have a decent-sized parking lot, and most days I park as close to the entrance as possible. But on the night that I'll never forget, I had to park at the far end of the lot, a decision I regret deeply. A couple of years back, I worked at another restaurant, a sports bar and grill that was just across the parking lot from where I work now. It wasn't a long gig, only 4 months or so, but I still have vivid memories of that time. Back then, I didn't have a car, so I either walked to work or got a ride. Often, I found myself walking home late at night, sometimes around 10 or 11, down a dimly lit street with hardly any cars passing by. It wasn't the safest feeling, especially as a young woman. Even worse, older men would sometimes make me feel uncomfortable, leering or commenting as I passed by. At the time, I was only 16, and it was unsettling how many drunken men at the bar would try to strike up conversations with me. There was one man in particular who stood out, someone I would later come to fear. He was always well-dressed, taller than most, with an air of sophistication that initially made me feel at ease. He was friendly at first, asking harmless questions about work and life, but as time went on, his questions became more personal. I began to feel uneasy around him, especially when one night he said something that stuck with me. It was a chaotic evening at the bar, as sports nights usually were, and I was working as the hostess, taking calls and directing customers. I remember stepping away from the hostess stand for a moment to clean the bathrooms, and when I returned, there he was, waiting for me. His usually composed demeanor had changed. He seemed off, his eyes darting around nervously, and his words took me by surprise. He mentioned my age, 16 at the time, and hinted that when I turned 18, he had a surprise for me. Then he left without another word. I stood there, stunned, before quickly finishing my shift and biking home, feeling watched the entire way. That encounter haunted me for years, but after leaving that job, I managed to push it to the back of my mind. Fast forward to the present day at my current job, where I had almost forgotten about him. Recently, though, an event stirred up those old memories, reminding me that some things are not so easily forgotten. It was a busy time at the restaurant, and with the rush of customers, I couldn't find a parking spot close to the building. I ended up parking at the far end of the lot, which wasn't ideal, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I worked my usual shift, which lasted until about 10 p.m., and as the front-end staff, closing duties often fell to me. That night was particularly hectic, and by the time I finished cleaning, my coworker was still waiting for a ride. I said my goodbyes to them and my manager and headed out the back door, exhausted from the long shift. As I approached my car, I dug through my bag for my keys, not paying much attention to my surroundings at first. It wasn't until I got closer that I noticed another car parked beside mine, a car I hadn't seen before. At first, I thought it might be my coworker's ride, but no one had come outside to leave, and my manager's car was still parked near the entrance. A sense of unease crept over me as I realized that there was someone sitting inside that unfamiliar car. I squinted in the darkness, trying to make out the person's face, and as I did, the driver suddenly turned on their headlights. The sudden brightness made me look away, and when I glanced back, the cabin light had switched on, illuminating the face of the man inside. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized him. It was the same man from the sports bar, though he looked older, more worn down. His face was expressionless, and that cold, vacant stare sent a wave of fear through me. He just sat there, waiting. For a brief moment, I felt a strange compulsion to continue walking toward my car, but instinct kicked in, and I stopped myself. I turned on my heel and quickly walked back to the restaurant. I could feel his eyes on me the entire time, but I didn't dare look back until I reached the door. When I finally did glance over my shoulder, the cabin light had turned off, and all I could see was the shadowy figure of the man still sitting in his car. I rushed back inside, startling my coworkers as I explained what had just happened. They immediately got serious and suggested we wait together until my coworker's ride arrived. We sat there for several minutes, the weight of the situation sinking in. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that this was the same man who had made that chilling remark about my 18th birthday all those years ago. He looked different now, more disheveled and sinister, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to show up again. When my coworker's ride finally arrived, we all walked outside together. I scanned the parking lot, half expecting to see his car still there, but it was gone. My car sat alone in the far corner, and my manager, who had dealt with a stalker in the past, insisted on walking me to it. She helped me check under the car and inside before I got in. I locked the doors as soon as I sat down and watched her drive away before taking a different route home, just to be safe. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining that hollow expression on his face, picturing him standing in the dark corners of my room, watching me. I considered calling the police, but I had little information to give, just a first name which could have easily been fake. In the end, I decided against it. Since that night, I haven't seen him again, but I still think about him every time I leave work. I always make sure to leave with my coworkers now, at my parents' insistence. I wonder what he had in mind when he told me to wait until I turned 18. Whatever it was, I hope I never find out. I got married just after turning 18. I was a smart kid academically, but seriously lacked practical life experience. By the time I was 20, my ex-husband, Ryan, and I were living in a rental home in a nice suburb outside of Denver. We shared the house with our close friend, Ben, who occupied a basement apartment with its own entrance. At the time, I was midway through nursing school. During that particular semester, I had early morning clinical rotations once a week. I've never been a morning person, so to avoid rushing, I'd load all my things, books, bags, and even my purse, into my car the night before. I didn't think much of it at the time, but that was another example of my lack of street smarts. One night, I asked Ryan to grab something from my car. He did, but he forgot to lock the door afterward. The next morning, I discovered my purse was gone. I immediately filed a police report. I was mostly worried because I had just started a new job at a hospital, and my social security card was still in my wallet. Looking back, it was a huge oversight, but I didn't realize how much trouble that small mistake would cause me. Shortly after the theft, odd things started happening around our home. At first, it was minor, like ding-dong ditch pranks late at night. Then it escalated. Someone spray-painted offensive symbols on our cars, egged our house, and even slashed Ben's tires. Initially, we thought it was just kids being mischievous, but after the vandalism caused significant damage, we involved the police. They didn't offer much help beyond recommending car alarms and floodlights. A few weeks later, around 2:30 in the morning, I received a call from the police in a nearby town. They had arrested a man named Dylan S., who was carrying my ID. When they asked him why he had it, he claimed I was his girlfriend. The officer recognized my name from the police report I had filed earlier and called to confirm whether I knew Dylan. I assured them I had no idea who he was. They told me I could retrieve my ID at the station. As time went on, things got stranger, though I didn't immediately connect the theft with the ongoing harassment. I started receiving bizarre messages on MySpace and Facebook from fake accounts. The messages were long and rambling, often incoherent, but they referenced personal details about my life. Whoever was behind them also messaged my friends, making it clear that this person knew me or knew people who did. Though the messages weren't overtly threatening, they were unsettling enough to make me feel increasingly uncomfortable. I deleted MySpace and blocked the accounts on Facebook, but new ones kept popping up. Then came emails, similarly cryptic and strange. One night, my friend Karen and I were sitting at home watching TV. Ryan and some other friends were out for the evening. While we relaxed, we started hearing noises coming from the garage, like someone was messing with the door. I went to check, but everything seemed fine. We often had raccoons around the house, so I assumed it was just that. But the noises continued, this time coming from the kitchen window, as if someone was knocking or scratching. Karen and I were freaked out. Unsure if it was just an animal or something more serious, we hesitated to call the police. At that moment, Karen's face turned pale as she stared past me. I spun around to see the handle of the front door jiggling. Our hearts pounded as we rushed to the back of the house, grabbing a small hammer and a kitchen knife along the way. We barricaded ourselves in one of the bedrooms, and I called the police. The dispatcher advised us to stay put, move furniture in front of the door, and wait for help to arrive. We did exactly that, bracing ourselves for whatever might happen next. When the police arrived, they found no signs of forced entry and no evidence that anyone had been trying to break in. We were left feeling shaken but with no real answers. Life went on, but we couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over us. Months later, our friend Chris asked if he and his girlfriend could crash at our place while their apartment was being renovated. We agreed, and they stayed in the guest room. The first night they were with us, we were all abruptly woken at 2 a.m. by Chris shouting. Ryan and I rushed into the room to find Chris standing by the window, visibly shaken. The window screen had been sliced open, and Chris explained that he woke up to someone trying to crawl through the window. The police came again, and this time they had something more to go on. Chris described the intruder as a young man with a semi-shaved head. When they dusted for fingerprints, they came back with a match. Dylan S., the same guy who had been caught with my ID months earlier. It turned out that Dylan and I had attended the same high school, though I had barely any memory of him. He lived not far from my parents' house, and a few old classmates remembered him as quiet and odd, someone who had dropped out before graduation. What chilled me most was when the police suggested that Dylan probably didn't realize anyone was staying in that bedroom and had assumed it was empty. Dylan was arrested again. His story to the police was beyond bizarre. He claimed we had been in a secret relationship, and he had been allowed into my home many times. I was stunned. He was charged with trespassing and breaking and entering, and I secured a restraining order. He spent about a month in jail and was fined. After his release, I didn't hear from him for a while, but I couldn't shake the fear that he would return. By Christmas 2010, I was 23 and in the process of divorcing Ryan, for reasons unrelated to Dylan. I moved into a small apartment in a less expensive suburb, hoping for a fresh start. The building had a locked main entrance, and I lived on the second floor, which provided some sense of security. By this time, I had graduated and was working as a nurse in a nursing home. But in the spring of 2011, the harassment resumed. It started with hang-up calls at work and letters addressed to me with no return address. Then the strange emails returned, and new fake social media accounts cropped up. Dylan's messages remained long, rambling, and unsettling, but not overtly violent. However, the persistence and invasiveness left me feeling trapped and paranoid. One night, I woke up to the sound of the doorbell ringing. Peering out the window, I saw Dylan standing under the floodlight outside my building. My heart raced. I ran to my neighbor's apartment and pounded on the door. My neighbor, a man who lived alone, went downstairs and confronted Dylan, telling him to leave. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, Dylan had disappeared. The situation worsened when Dylan began reaching out to my friends and family. He messaged them through Facebook, claiming he had important information for me or accusing me of owing him money. My friends blocked him as soon as they could, but the harassment spread further. He even confronted my younger sister at her apartment in the city and later showed up at my cousin's high school track practice, demanding information about me. It seemed there was no escape. Eventually, in 2012, things came to a head. A friend of mine, Lisa, was staying with me temporarily while she looked for her own place. One night, I worked a double shift and didn't get home until nearly midnight. Lisa had texted me earlier, saying she wouldn't be home that night, so I expected the apartment to be empty. But when I arrived, the door was unlocked, and the apartment was eerily dark. Something felt wrong. I knew Lisa would have left at least one light on. I ran downstairs to get my neighbor, who was having a party, and he came up with me to check the apartment. As we searched the place, he opened the pantry door, and there, crouched inside, was Dylan. My neighbor acted quickly, putting him in a chokehold while I called the police. Dylan was arrested again, this time facing more serious charges. He was convicted of aggravated stalking and breaking and entering, among other offenses. I met his parents in court. They were apologetic, explaining that Dylan suffered from bipolar disorder. They claimed he was manageable when medicated, but when off his meds, he became erratic. After that incident, I didn't hear from Dylan for several years. But in 2016, he found me on Facebook again. This time, I was 29 and had learned to be firmer. I warned him that any contact would result in police action, and I blocked him everywhere. But just recently, he tried to connect with my new husband on social media. To this day, I remain hypervigilant about my security. Doors are always locked, and I monitor my accounts closely. Twice, my life was thrown into chaos because of simple oversights. A car door left unlocked and an apartment door likely forgotten. Dylan's actions led to years of anxiety, distrust, and financial mess. My identity was compromised when my social security card was stolen, leading to a long battle with fraud and the IRS. Although I've grown and learned from these experiences, the paranoia lingers. Even now, when something as simple as a cracked windshield occurs, my mind immediately jumps to worst-case scenarios. I'm more cautious than ever, always on guard, because I've seen firsthand how one person's obsession can wreak havoc on your life.